Ever wonder about life's mysteries and how what we may not be aware of could be affecting the outcomes of we here on Earth? With permission from Dr. Paul Leon Masters, founder of the University of Sedona, I'd like to share with you one of his mystical insights. Dr. Masters' mystical insights are based on over 50 years of consciousness research with thousands of his students. Today's subject is based on the conclusions after half a century of research. The subject is on today's clinical psychology and psychiatry, in contrast with an enlightened society. Except for a few souls in this world who are mystically aware, the practice of psychology and psychiatry will not create a truly mentally healthy society. As it currently stands, the world standard for mental health is collective neurosis. The occupation of the clinical psychologist or psychiatrist is to adjust the mind to be functional in a dysfunctional society. What is called mental health is the ability to function with that which is the dysfunctional collectively. The illusions of one's personal isolation must be made to fit into the illusions and vogue of whatever is considered reality in present-day society. The basis of identity as viewed by clinical psychology and psychiatry is that the self, one's identity, is that of a personal ego identity, a product of an organism bumping up against itself in an environment through a long period of time, first to form a simple awareness of itself, and eventually to evolve into an environmentally created identity or ego. Put enough egos together and you form an ego society. If for whatever reason one ego cannot function in the collective ego society in which it dwells, it then is considered dysfunctional, with the role of today's mental health clinician being to adjust it, to get it back into step with the collective thinking, the neurosis of today's ego society. The flaw in all this is that a society comprised of personal ego identities is still a society of persons isolated from each other by virtue of believing themselves to be separate, isolated entities. And separate personal egos are fragile at best. They can be quickly shattered in a moment by outward life-changing events. When individuals do find common ground together, or when groups rally around some common belief of heritage or ideology, this fragmentary sense of separateness can seem diminished. This sense of belonging, of meaning, can seem to flourish under the same banner of religious, nationalistic, or lifestyle beliefs. Each, in its own way, encourages the illusion of meaning in personal ego existence collectively. But in truth, these personal egos still have no foundation, no reality in truth or in fact. They are not seen as part of an eternal whole, but rather as fragments of an illusionary existence. When identity is viewed as a personal ego identity, even when it functions within a societal group, it is still an isolated entity unto itself. And being still an isolated ego identity, it can function within the collective group for a time until, given the right or wrong set of circumstances, it finds itself in conflict with others or with the collective group. Of course, clinical psychology and psychiatry will defend itself by stating that it is not the business of philosophy or religion. It is in the business of making people functional within the collective framework of society. As clinical psychology and psychiatry currently stand, that is a true assessment. The problem is that they become the spokespersons or standard bearers for what society is to believe about the mind and, most importantly, human identity. In this manner, the illusion of personal ego identity is perpetuated, continuing the ego-centered, fragmented society that breeds conflict and wars. In contrast, in an enlightened society, occupied by enlightened souls, clinical psychology and psychiatry as they are currently practiced would be, at best, considered primitive. Why? In an enlightened society, personal ego identity would not exist. The mind would be considered a channel through which universal consciousness could be expressed. All members of an enlightened society would know themselves to be individualized expressions of some unique attributes of the universal whole, universal presence, mind, spirit, or God. Souls incarnating into such a society would not have to be taught about the relationship to the universal whole or presence, for they would incarnate with a knowingness of their reality. They would incarnate not to serve temporary rules, but to be consciously co-creative with the universal presence. For these reasons, in such an enlightened society of soul minds, clinical psychology or psychiatry would not exist. Religion, as it is now known on the physical earth plane, would not exist. They would not exist because, from whatever frame of reference one would choose to think about an enlightened society, such a society would be a collection of Christs, Buddhas, Krishnas, and so on. The common denominator for all persons would be universal consciousness identity, created forms embodying one universal mind. What is the bottom line? There is no doubt that clinical psychology and psychiatry do play a major role in society by attempting to care for those who are severely mentally ill, and they should be thanked and acknowledged for their efforts. This commentary is directed toward working with the people who are not suffering from some psychosis, but rather from psychoneurosis. With this in mind, let's go on to what can be done. We must keep in mind, though, that with but few exceptions, those who enter the field of clinical psychology and psychiatry are basically illusionary personal egos attempting to treat other illusionary personal egos so that they may function with an illusionary society comprised of illusionary, inwardly fragmented, fragile, personal, ego-centered identities. Such a society is a virtual breeding ground for conflicts and further isolation in the future, until an egotistically driven maniac collects groupings of people unhappy and unfulfilled by their existence and directs them into another war, feeding them with the illusion that such conquest will fill the void within their souls. Such has been and will ever be the repeating history of this physical earth plane. To be of value, clinical psychology and psychiatry should have two objectives. The first is to do what they have been doing, which is to make a person functional within the neurotic whole. This would then serve to facilitate communication for the important second objective. The second objective would be to lay seeds for a new concept of identity, universal identity with oneness. To be certain, for the vast majority of persons, universal identity, oneness with God, would be but a concept, and they would not be suddenly transformed into enlightened mystics. But the seeds would have been planted to grow in the soil of future lifetimes, to meet the needs of those who are functional in a collective ego-based society and who feel an inner God presence prompting them to move beyond a personal ego-based psychological understanding of the mind and consciousness. The International Metaphysical Ministry founded the Theocentric Life Society. This specialized ministry utilizes educational, counseling, and life coaching in theocentric psychology. Theocentric psychology's focus is on completing the understanding of the mind and consciousness, emphasizing that consciousness comes from one creative source, namely universal mind, spirit, God, and that true identity is being aware of oneness and the cooperation of the outer human with the inner spirit. In this way, the soul is freed of the collective neurosis that binds it, bringing forth universal consciousness and its God-provided potentials. The universal process has been served. The universal embryo has been nourished. Dr. Paul Masters. We will be presenting more of Dr. Masters' Mystical Insights on the station KUOSFM.com every week. For more free complimentary lectures and insights, click on to the University of Sedona's website at universityofsedona.com.